If you're new to Home Assistant or thinking about jumping in, it's easy to get intimidated. The user interface isn't always intuitive if you're coming from something like SmartThings or even the Amazon Echo. The nomenclature can be confusing, and then there's the whole YAML thing. But it is a really powerful platform to build a smart home. So in this video, we're going to do a little Home Assistant 101 to get you more comfortable with the Home Assistant platform, because I want you to be able to automate the boring stuff. Welcome back to Slacker Labs. My name is Jeff. I often hear that Home Assistant is hard and not at all user-friendly. And part of the reason I think that feeling exists is there's no real manual. No place for you to go to get that foundational stuff. Sure, there's tons of documentation that covers things like how to write an automation, and lots of videos on YouTube that cover things like adding local to your devices and integrating your washing machine. But oftentimes in those videos, we leave out the basic stuff. So this video is an attempt to fix that. We're going to do a little Home Assistant 101. We're going to take a look at the Home Assistant user interface so you know where to find things. We're going to talk about things you should do right after you've installed Home Assistant, like setting up some add-ons. We'll talk about the differences between devices, entities, automations, scripts, and more. And we'll touch briefly on those dreaded configuration files. So by the end of this video, hopefully it won't feel so foreign. Anyway, we have a lot to talk about, so let's jump in. This video picks up right after you've installed Home Assistant. And the reason for that is there's a lot of different ways to install Home Assistant. Raspberry Pis are always a good choice because they're easy to get started with and they're powerful enough that they can run most smart homes. But they're not the only option. You can run Home Assistant on other hardware. I'll leave some links in the description of this video on how to install Home Assistant on the different hardware platforms, for those of you that haven't taken the plunge yet. For those of you that have already got Home Assistant installed and are wondering how the heck this is supposed to help you automate the boring stuff, let's go on a tour. When you first log in, you'll find yourself on this overview page. This is the default dashboard, and as you add devices and integrations, things will just automatically pop up here. If you're just starting with Home Assistant, I recommend just leaving this as is until you're ready to tackle building your own Lovelace dashboard. When you're ready to build your own, you can click the three dots in the upper right and choose Edit Dashboard. You can take ownership, and if you want, start with a blank dashboard. But once you're in control of this dashboard, adding things here is going to require you to take an extra step after adding devices. So to keep things simple, I just recommend leaving it as is for now. Next on the left menu is Energy. This is Home Assistant's built-in energy dashboard, which is meant to help you track your smart home energy use. Since this is a new install, there's not much for us to do here yet, but once you have some devices in Home Assistant capable of monitoring energy, you can come back here and walk through the process and get a better idea of what energy your smart home is using. Next, we have Map, which is just what it says, a map showing your Home Assistant zones and where any device trackers are in relation to those zones. We currently just have our home zone, and since we don't have any device trackers, there's nothing to see here. But once you do have device trackers tied to users in Home Assistant, you can use this as kind of your own Find My Friends map. Next up, we have both the logbook and history, and these I use for pretty much the same thing, which is troubleshooting. You can use these two options to get a list of your entities and their states. Logbook shows you a list of all of your entities as they change states, and history shows you the state changes for each of your devices or entities. These both can get really sluggish depending on how many devices you have in Home Assistant, and you can adjust what shows up here. But the reality is, I rarely come in here because I can get this information in other places. Media shows a collection of all your local media, and this could be recordings from any cameras you have in Home Assistant, or even audio files that you've added to your Home Assistant instance. Recently, it got a browser for radio stations, as well as the ability to test your text-to-speech integrations. And since we've just set this up, we only have Google Translate, which is installed by default. At the bottom, we have developer tools. First up here is States. I spend a lot of time in this one when I'm checking on new devices or ones that may not be working. It provides a list of all your entities and shows you their current state as well as the state of their attributes. which can be helpful if you're trying to track down what attributes a state has or what those values are when you're setting up template sensors, automations, or even scripts. Services is a list of the services installed on your machine, and really the only function of this one is so that you could come in here and execute a service manually. For example, if you wanted to trigger an automation manually, you could come in here and choose the automation trigger service, pick your automation, tell it that you want to ignore conditions, and then run it, which should execute your automation. Template is another good troubleshooting spot. Here is a demo template that shows you the power of Jinja and what you can do with templates. You can type your template and in real time see your output, which makes it handy for trying to dial in those templates. Events can be used if you want to manually fire an event, and these show up in your logbook, and you can also use events as automation triggers. But I don't use them all that much, but they do come in handy, especially if you want to automate something based on when a Home Assistant starts or when it shuts down. Statistics would be a place to see stats on your current entities. You'll get a handy look at the issues like entities with a missing state, which could mean they've been orphaned and need to be removed, but since this is a new install, we don't have anything to see here. Now we move on to configuration, and this is one of those menu options you'll probably be in a lot. Over time, Home Assistant will show you pending updates to both Home Assistant Core, the Home Assistant operating system if you happen to be running that, as well as updates to any of your add-ons. And currently, there's no update showing here because I just recently installed this. Home Assistant Cloud is where you can connect your Home Assistant instance to the Nabu Casa Cloud. For a small fee, the Nabu Casa Cloud gets you a secure remote connection to your smart home. You also get access to the Nabu Casa text-to-speech integration, which is pretty good, and the easy method of connecting Home Assistant to both your Google and Amazon assistants. I also want to point out that none of your smart home data is actually stored in the Nabu Casa Cloud. All this service does is provide a connection, or a proxy, to your instance, and allows you to have a secure remote connection without having to open ports on your router. So if you don't want to mess with setting up SSL certs and router port forwarding, Nabu Casa can help you do that. Next in this menu is Devices and Services. This is the place you would come when you want to install Home Assistant integrations. And integrations are connections to either services or devices and typically result in adding some new entities to your setup. And if Home Assistant finds any compatible devices or services on your network, it will helpfully prompt you to configure them. But you can also hit the three dots and choose Ignore if you don't want to see them, or you can hit Configure and start the add process. You can also hit Add Integrations at the bottom and get a list of the currently installed integrations. Then we have a place for devices and one for entities, and this is where things start to get a bit confusing. As far as I'm concerned, devices are basically just a collection of entities. For example, this forecast device has a home entity in it that contains the current weather and forecast for my house. There's also a disabled entity for the hourly forecast that we could enable. Another example of a device could be a motion sensor that might have a binary sensor entity that is on when motion is detected and a sensor for reporting the current battery level. I see entities as individual objects. An entity might be a binary sensor or a switch. But to make it even more confusing, entities can also be automations or scripts. And I typically use the word entity in any of my conversations about Home Assistant since it could refer to pretty much anything on this machine. Besides, entities are typically what you'll refer to in automations, especially if you're writing them in YAML. And areas give you a way to carve up your house into sections, in which you can add devices to specific sections of your house. That way you can refer to a collection of devices and entities as an area and not have to worry about all the specific names of the entities in that area. The next option in this configuration menu is Automations and Scenes. In Automations, you can start to automate all of that BS in your house. We really need a whole video to get into the details of automations. But any automation you add here will be stored in the automation.yaml file, which we'll see here in just a minute. Just click Add, and then you can define a name, pick your trigger, which is what event you want to kick off this automation, as well as define any conditions that allow you to put some constraints around when this automation actually runs, and actions where you would actually define the tasks this automation will do. automations are probably going to be where you spend a lot of your time, at least in the beginning, because I assume you're coming to Home Assistant because you want to automate the boring stuff. Scenes is where you can save the current state of your devices. Like automation, Scenes probably requires a more in-depth video, but think of Scenes as a snapshot of device states. So if you find a color combination of lights in your living room that you like, you can open up Scenes, click Add Scene, give it a name, and then select all of those devices that are involved in those lights and save it. Now you'll be able to turn on that scene and instantly set all of the devices back to those states. You can also connect Scenes to your Amazon Echo and Google Home, allowing you to activate them via voice command or using them in routines. You can also add scripts. Scripts are basically automations without triggers, which I think causes some confusion. After all, why do you need scripts when you can do the same thing in an automation? But I tend to use scripts anytime I have a set of conditions and actions I want to be able to repeat in different automations. And scripts allow me to do those once and not have to write them in every one of those automations. We'll spend some more time in the future talking about the power of scripts, but until you get into some more advanced setup, you could probably ignore them and just build automations. At last, in this section is helpers. If you've seen some of my other videos, you'll recognize helpers. These are universal entities that you can add to help add some context or help you in your automation efforts. These can be virtual buttons, places to store text or numbers, as well as dates and a few other things. They come in handy with filling in gaps to some of the integration and devices. For example, you could use a helper to add a volume slider for your text-to-speech integrations, giving you an easy way to change the volume. Blueprints are basically pre-built automations and scripts built by the community and the Home Assistant team. You can download these blueprints and then just fill in the blanks. Like this motion-activated light. All you need to do is pick a motion sensor and a light and set the amount of time you want that light to be on after the motion sensor no longer senses motion. These come in handy when you're just beginning and have a lot of common patterns you want to automate and don't want to have to deal with writing out a full automation. They are a very good way to get you started with some of those advanced automations. Next, we have add-ons, backups, and Supervisor. If you're not running a supervised version of Home Assistant, you won't have access to the add-on store or the Supervisor. But add-ons are simply Dockerized apps that extend Home Assistant functionality. You can install these add-ons without the add-on store. But if you're just starting out, I recommend sticking with supervised versions of Home Assistant so that you can use the add-on store. It does make things easier. To grab one of these for your Home Assistant instance, you just go to the add-on store and then click on the add-on you want and then follow the prompts. Backups is where you would restore or create any manual backups. There's no way to schedule backups on a regular basis without an add-on. But you can choose to do a backup anytime you perform a Home Assistant update or an add-on update. System contains a report of your system data. Typically the only thing I come in here for is the Supervisor log, or for locating hardware I just plugged in, which you can find by hitting the three dots and choosing hardware. And of course, if you need to reboot your host or shut it down, you can do that from here. Next, we have dashboards, where you can define dashboards for specific things like wall-mounted tablets or even specific users. Tags in the configuration menu is where you would set up or link NFC tags. And people and zones are where you can come to set up your person entities. A person entity allows you to link a user account to multiple presence detection sources. If I was adding a new family member or user that was going to be using the Home Assistant front end, I would just start with people. Click Add Person, give them a name, and then click this Allow Person to Log In, which will bring up the panel to create a user account, and you can do it all without having to leave this screen. And zones are for defining your zones. To add a zone, just click Add Zone, give it a name, locate the center of your zone on the map either with drag and drop or entering the latitude and longitude, and then define the radius around it. Then any device tracker that enters that radius will be marked as being in the zone until it leaves that radius. And lastly, we have settings, which I feel is a little generic since we've been dealing with settings in other parts of this configuration section. But anyway, when you come in here, you get dropped in server controls, which has the restart option for Home Assistant. You may need to use this one from time to time, especially if you make changes to your configuration files directly. General will look familiar. It's all the stuff that we defined when we installed Home Assistant, and if you need to update any of that or change it, you can do that here. Logs is a way for you to view your Home Assistant log, and Info has some information about your current version of Home Assistant and the underlying hardware. Also, it has a list of all the integrations and their load time, and for some of them, the ability to click on issues and go to the current list of issues for that integration, just in case you see something weird and you want to report it, or you want to see if someone else has reported it. The next option on the left menu is Notifications, which opens the notification panel. Here you'll see messages anytime Home Assistant finds a new device, or if someone tries to log in with bad information. And you can also set up other information to come here as well. And lastly, you have your profile, which you can set your language, theme, edit the menu on the left, and other things that are specific to your user account when you log into Home Assistant. Okay, now that you have a general lay of the landscape, let's talk about some of the things you should do right after you've installed Home Assistant. First up, under your profile, I would turn on Advanced Mode. What this does is give you access to a few more options that can make your Home Assistant life easier. For example, if we head back over to Configuration and Settings, we'll see that now under Service Control, we have more options. First, at the top, we can run a check on our configuration to make sure there's no errors in any of the YAML. This is a good button to hit anytime you want to see if the changes you just made are going to cause a problem. And you get these options below Restart that allow you to reload parts of your configuration without restarting. And these are domain-based, not file-based. So if you reload automations, it will reload all automations regardless of where they are in your configuration, which comes in handy when you start to split things up. Next up, we're going to install some add-ons. Now, I suggest normally installing add-ons as you need them. They do take up resources, so you don't want a whole bunch of add-ons that you're not going to be using running. But these three that we're going to walk through setting up are pretty good general add-ons to have. First up, head back to the add-ons link in the configuration menu. Click on Add-ons Door, and the first one we're going to install is Terminal and SSH. This one will provide you with command line access, which can be helpful when the front end stops responding or you forget your Home Assistant password. Just click on Terminal and SSH in the add-ons door and then click Install. When it's done, we need to configure it. And the best way to set this up is with an SSH key. But if you don't have an SSH key or you don't want to mess with creating one, you can just put in a password. The benefit to having an SSH key is you don't need a password, you just need a physical file. So if you forget your password, you could still get in. But in this case, I just used DemoBox for my password. After you've made your changes, be sure you hit Save under each one of these sections. In Network, set the port to 22. If you don't do this step, you won't be able to SSH into this box. Then of course save this and return to Info and click Start. Once this is running, you should be able to remote into your Home Assistant instance over SSH using the user root and the password that you created in this setup. Next up is Samba Share. The install process works the same. You find the add-on in the add-on store and click Install. The Samba add-on allows you to access the configuration files and folders over the network. This comes in handy if you want to edit or copy the files from your instance over to another computer. And it gives you another way to get into your configuration if for some reason you can't access the web interface. Before you start this add-on, you'll need to make some configuration changes as well. Modify your allowed hosts to ensure your local network computers can access this device. And then you'll want to set up a password and potentially modify the username. After that, click Save, and then start it up. After that, you should be able to browse to this instance from your desktop computer. And once you connect, it will prompt you for your username and password that you just created. And last up is Studio Code Server, which will allow you to edit your configuration files right in the browser. The editor this add-on provides does things like autocomplete when searching for entity names, which comes in handy, and it can tell you if your YAML is badly formatted, which also comes in handy. To install, you click on the add-on and then install. And like the other add-ons we just set up, this one doesn't require any configuration. Although you will want to click this Show in Sidebar option, which will add a link to your left menu. After that, you can just start it up. Okay, now that we've gone through the user interface and installed some add-ons, let's take a look at those configuration files. For that, let's head to that Studio Code Server link in the left menu. And here it is. Not a lot here, but there soon will be. The main file here is the configuration.yaml file. This is where Home Assistant will look for its configuration information. And when starting out, this is where you will most likely be making changes. You could put your entire configuration in this one file. I think Dr. Z's does that, or at least he did at one time. Or you could use includes to separate some of the parts. Frank, one of the prolific Home Assistant contributors, and rumor has it, advanced cybernetic organism from the future, sent here to show us how to automate everything, just has a single line in his configuration.yaml that points to another directory. And as you can see, by default, Home Assistant puts automations, scripts, and scenes in their own file. And when you create those via the user interface, this is where Home Assistant puts them. So if you want to be able to use the front end to add automations, scripts, and scenes, you need to leave those as is. Another important bit of information here is Home Assistant configuration files are in YAML, which is why those files of course end in .yaml. YAML was designed to be human readable, but it also utilizes Python's nested indentation style, which means that indenting lines is important. And if you ever see an error stating something like mapping values are not allowed here, you probably have an indentation issue. For now, I would start simple and just use the configuration.yaml file as much as possible. If you find yourself doing a lot of YAML editing, which hopefully you won't, you may decide to split your configuration up between more files, or even use packages like you may have seen in some of my previous videos. But let's not add more complexity until we absolutely have to. And that's it for this video. For those of you that stuck around to the end, I hope this video gave you a little more information about the sandbox that you're building your smart home in. If, however, this video prompted more questions than it answered, let me know in the comments. I plan on continuing this series and building on this new install in a way that allows you to build a foundation for your smart home from the bottom up. Some of the videos I want to tackle in this series are things like Automations 101, integrating Z-Wave and Zigbee devices, setting up your presence detection, building a text-to-speech notification system, and even building a security system from scratch. And of course, if there's other topics you would like to see in this From Scratch series, let me know in the comments as well. If you want to help Slacker Labs and the mission to help you automate the boring stuff, you can find a link to the official Slacker Labs t-shirt store, as well as affiliate links and even a link to buy me a coffee if you so choose in the description of this video. Or just let me know that you found value in this video by hitting that like button. And consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already for more smart home content like this. As always, thanks for taking time out of your home automation projects to watch mine. Until next time, go automate the boring stuff.